good evening, or perhaps good night. If you've made your way here in the long hours after midnight, the difference may already have stopped mattering. You've come back, perhaps, because the last 3 episodes helped you sleep, or you've come for the first time, and the 4th episode happened to be the one the algorithm offered. Either is fine. The Almanac is patient. Tonight stands on its own. If you're listening in bed, I'd ask you to do very little. Close your eyes. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders drop, even a little, even if you didn't know they were tight. The story does not need your attention. It will keep moving whether you follow it or not. If you drift, that is the point. If you wake briefly to catch a single sentence and then sink again, that is good. In the first episode, we walked the shape of the world, 9 realms joined by one great tree. In the second, we met the Wanderer, the Allfather, the Hanged God. In the third, we went down into the dwarven forges and watched, in a single strange wager, the making of the hammer that would defend the gods. Tonight, we follow a quieter and a sadder story. A story about a wolf who was a child, a wolf who was raised in the high halls of Asgard among the very beings who would one day decide they had to bind him. This is the story of how that binding was done, and of the small ribbon, woven of impossible things, that finally held the wolf, and of the God, the brave God, the just God, who put his hand into the wolf's mouth so that the binding could be made. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The 3 children of Loki. Before we go to the wolf, and before we go to the chain, we should sit, for a while, with the figure who gave the wolf his life. We met him, briefly, in the last episode, the trickster, the one who cut Sif's hair while she slept, and who then was made to descend, by Thor's anger, into the underground halls of the dwarves to bring back gifts of recompense. We saw him there at the bellows. We saw him take the shape of a fly. We saw him try, in his way, to ruin the work of the smiths, and we saw the work be made anyway, despite him. Loki. The old Norse sources do not give us a tidy biography of him. They give us scattered passages, in the Eddic poems, and in Snorri's Prose Edda, and from those passages we are meant to assemble a figure. The figure that emerges, when you look at the text together, is more complicated than the figure who appears in modern films and comic books. The modern Loki is, often, a quick and witty schemer with the suggestion of a redemption arc. The Norse Loki is something stranger. He is something older. And tonight's story is one of the places where his strangeness shows. The texts call him, sometimes, a son of giants. His father, in the surviving accounts, was a giant named Farbauti, whose name means, roughly, cruel striker. His mother was Laufey, whose name means leafy, or leaf island. There has been long argument among scholars about whether Laufey was a giantess or a goddess. The surviving texts are not certain. What is certain is that Loki, by birth, was not of the Aesir. He was a being who came into Asgard from outside, and who was made a member of the Aesir by oath of blood brotherhood with Odin. The text preserved this oath. The Eddic poem Lokasenna refers to it. Loki and Odin had, at some point in the deep past, sworn together that they would drink no ale that was not poured for them both. They had become brothers in the older Germanic sense, bound by ceremony, bound by ritual, bound to share a single fate. This is worth holding in mind as we walk through tonight's story. Loki is, by oath, Odin's brother. Even when he is doing things the gods do not approve of, He is doing them inside the bonds of that brotherhood. The gods cannot simply expel him. He has the rights of one of their own. Loki had a wife in Asgard. Her name was Sigyn. She does not appear often in the surviving sources, but when she appears, she is faithful to him beyond any reasonable measure. There's a story we will tell in a later episode in which she stands beside him for ages, with a bowl held above his face. We will not tell that story tonight. Tonight is not that story. What Loki had that we do need tonight were 3 other children by another woman, a giantess. Her name, in the surviving accounts, was Angerboda. Angerboda, the name means in Old Norse, sorrow bringer or grief bringer. The texts do not describe her closely. They tell us only where she lived, which was in Jotunheim, the world of the giants, in a forest the sources call Jarnvidr, the Iron Wood. They tell us she had relations with Loki, somehow, at some point, and they tell us that she bore him 3 children, the Iron Wood, the Sorrow Bringer, the 3 children. This is the kind of detail that, in the older Norse imagination, would have settled, in the listener's mind, the kind of children we are about to meet. They were not going to be ordinary. They were not going to be welcome. They were going to be of the wild forests, of the giants' world, of the deep places that the high halls of Asgard did not reach. And they were not. The first of Loki's children by Angerboda was a daughter. Her name was Hel. She came into the world, the texts tell us, half one color and half another. One half of her body, the surviving accounts say, was the color of living flesh. The other half was the color of corpse. She was, from her birth, marked. The second of Loki's children was a serpent. He had no proper name at first. He grew. He kept growing. He grew until he was longer than the world could contain. The third of Loki's children was a wolf. We will get to him in a moment. The gods, the sources tell us, did not know about these children at first. The trickster had kept them in the Iron Wood, away from Asgard, away from the eyes of the Aesir. He was raising them, perhaps, or he was hiding them. The text does not specify which, but Odin, the Allfather, who saw far, whose ravens flew across the 9 worlds at dawn and brought him back what they had seen, Odin learned of them. Whether through his ravens or through one of the seers he sometimes consulted, the texts do not say. He learned, and what he learned alarmed him. He learned that these 3 children of Loki had been seen, by those who could see such things, in the vision of the future. He learned that all 3 would be present at Ragnarok, the great unmaking at the end of the world. He learned that the daughter, Hel, would gather the dead under her cold rule. He learned that the serpent would rise from the sea and poison the air with his breath. And he learned that the wolf would do something terrible. Something the surviving sources hint at, but in the early passages do not yet describe. So Odin acted. He sent for the 3 children to be brought to Asgard, and when they came, the gods sat in their hall, and they looked at them, and they decided what was to be done. Hel, the daughter, the god sent down. They sent her into Niflheim, the lowest of the cold worlds beneath the world, and they gave her dominion there. They gave her a hall called Eljudnir. They gave her a table called Hunger, and a knife called Famine. They gave her authority over the dead who had not died well, those who had died of sickness or of age, the dead who would not feast in Valhall or in the halls of Freya, the great gentle mass of the unspectacular dead. The gods made her queen of those. She would gather them under her hand and rule them in the cold dark below. This is, in its way, one of the strangest acts of administration in any mythology. The gods looked at a half-dead child and said, You will look after the half-dead. You will look after the ones who go quietly. There is something honest about it. There is something, too, that is cruel. The texts do not say which the gods intended. Jormungandr, the serpent, the second child, Odin took him and threw him into the sea, the great sea that surrounds Midgard. The serpent kept growing in the sea. He grew until he could encircle Midgard entirely, until he could put his own tail in his own mouth. He lies there still, in the world's ocean, biting his tail, his body coiled around all of the lands of men. The sailors of the old Scandinavian world knew his name. They knew that what they were sailing on was, in some long old reckoning, the back of him. He waits in the sea. He will rise at Ragnarok. And then there was the wolf. The wolf was different. The wolf the gods decided they could not yet send away. They brought him into Asgard. They thought perhaps that if he was raised among them, if he was raised in the high halls, he might grow up to be something other than what the seers had foretold. They thought, perhaps, that the future was not yet certain, that the wolf could be loved into something gentler. They were wrong, but they were not, in the beginning, foolish to try. We will come to what happened. His name was Fenrir. In the Old Norse, Fenris Ulfar, the wolf of the fen, or the wolf of the wetland, the lowland wolf, the wolf of the dark, wet places at the edges of the settled world. The name carries, in its sound, the kind of cold the old Scandinavians would have known well. The marsh in winter, the mist over the bog, the wolf that you heard at the edge of your light at night, and that you knew, even in the safety of your hall, was there. He came to Asgard as a child, as a pup, the texts tell us, though the texts do not use that word. He was small. He was the kind of small that grows. The gods looked at him in their hall, and they took him in. And the texts pause here before they tell us what came next. We pause too. Sleep, if you're ready to. The next chapter will tell you what it was like to feed him. Chapter 2, The Wolf, Brought to Asgard. Imagine, if you can, the high hall of the gods. The hall is built of timber and gold. The roof is shielded with shields. The texts use that phrase, that the roof of Valhall was thatched with the war shields of the slain. The fires are kept burning in long stone hearths down the center of the hall. The benches along the walls are long and broad and meant to hold many. The Aesir gather here at evening to drink, to talk, to argue, to settle the business of the worlds. Into that hall, the gods brought a wolf pup. He was small at the beginning. The texts make this point. He was small enough that the gods could carry him. He was small enough to be set down on the bench beside them, small enough to be looked at in the firelight as a curious and unusual ward. But he grew. Wolves, in the natural world, the old Scandinavians knew, grew quickly. A wolf pup at 6 weeks was a small bundle. A wolf pup at 6 months was a creature you would not lightly approach. A wolf at 1 year was, in the eyes of any farmer in the long north, fully a wolf. Already capable of taking a sheep, already capable of running with a pack across a frozen field, already wearing the full silvered coat of the adult. The growth of a wolf, the people of the Old North knew, was fast and frightening and could not be slowed. Fenrir's growth was faster. The texts do not give us numbers. They do not say in what week he doubled in size, in what month he tripled, They give us instead the impression of growth that exceeded its own kind. They give us a wolf who, in the great hall of the gods, grew and kept growing until he was the size of a horse, until he was the size of 2 horses, until he was the size of one of the high benches in the hall. This is a detail worth letting settle. The benches in a Norse longhouse were long enough to seat many warriors and broad enough to sleep on. To say a wolf was the size of one of those benches is, in the imagination of the old Scandinavian world, to say a wolf that would not fit in any normal hall, a wolf that bowed the timbers when he moved, a wolf whose breath, when he panted, fogged the fires. The gods watched him grow. They had taken him in for a reason. They had thought, and the texts hint at this even where they do not say it, that if the wolf was raised among them, if he was given the kindness of the high hall, he might be made gentle. They had thought perhaps that the prophecies of what he would do at Ragnarok could be unmade by love. It is one of the most poignant choices in all of Norse mythology. The gods, knowing what the seers had said, the gods having looked at the future, choosing nonetheless to try. And the wolf, in the early years, did not refuse the kindness. He came into the hall. He ate what was given to him. He grew. But he was not, the texts tell us, a tame wolf. He was not a pet. He was not, in the way of a dog of the household, a being that lay at the feet of the gods and looked up at them in trust. He was something else. He was something the gods had brought into their own hall, and that was changing, week by week, into something they had not foreseen. The wolf grew, not just in body. He grew in the strangeness of his eye. He grew in the depth of his voice. He grew in the way the other gods, when they came past him in the hall, found themselves walking a little wider, found themselves not making eye contact, found themselves, without knowing why, holding their breath. There came a point, the texts tell us, at which only one of the gods was still willing to feed him. Before we go to that god, who is the heart of tonight's story, we should sit a little longer with the wolf himself. The Old Norse word for wolf, Ulfr, is one of the oldest words in the Germanic family of languages. It is related to the German wolf, the English wolf, the Gothic wolves. It is, in the long deep past, one of the words that the Germanic peoples carried with them from their earliest reckoning of the world. And the wolf, in the imagination of those peoples, was not one thing, it was many. The wolf was, in some readings, the enemy, the animal at the edge of the firelight that took the sheep from the fold, and that, in the long cold winters, came into settlements when the snow lay deep. The wolf was the thing the hall was built against, the thing the door was barred against, the thing the children, in their straw-stuffed beds, learned to listen for in the night quiet. But the wolf was also, in other readings, the kindred figure, the animal that, of all the animals in the Norse imagination, was closest to the warrior. The wolf warriors of the old Germanic peoples, the Ulfhednar, were a specific class of fighters who, in the surviving sources, took on the strength and the savagery of the wolf in battle. They wore wolf pelts. They were said, in the older heroic poems, to fight as wolves fight. They were the kindred of the wolf, and there were the wolves of the gods themselves. Odin, the Allfather, kept 2 wolves at his throne. Their names, we learned in the 2nd episode, were Geri and Freki, greedy and ravenous. Odin fed them, from his own table, the meat that came to him in Valhall. The wolves of Odin were not, in the surviving sources, a problem. They were, in their way, members of the household of the gods. They were honored. They were kept. So when Fenrir came to Asgard as a small thing, the gods were not afraid of him because he was a wolf. They were not, in the early days, afraid of him at all. They had wolves at the Allfather's own throne. Wolves were known. Wolves were, in their way, kindred. What changed was not the kind of being Fenrir was. What changed was the scale of him. The simple, terrible fact that, week by week, the small thing they had taken in was becoming larger than any wolf had ever been. He was passing out of the country of the familiar wolf. He was passing into the country of the unfamiliar, the country of the monstrous, the country in which the gods, who had known wolves all their long lives, no longer knew what was sitting in their hall. There came a point, the texts tell us, at which only one of the gods was still willing to feed him. We will come to that god in the next chapter. He is the heart of tonight's story. What you should hold from the short telling is the shape of the situation that had come, slowly, to be true, in the hall of Asgard. The gods had taken in a child. The child had grown into something the gods could no longer pretend was a child. The gods had not yet, in their council, decided what to do about it. They were watching. They were waiting. They were hoping, perhaps, that the growth would slow, or that the wolf would, by some unforeseen change, become something other than what the seers had said. But the wolf did not slow, and the day was coming when the gods would have to act. Before we walk into that day, we should meet the god who fed him. Chapter 3. Tyr, the one who fed him. There was a god whose name was Tyr. The name, in Old Norse, was spelled in 3 letters, Tr. In runic carving, it was a single rune, the Tyr rune, which stood for both the god and for the sound, at the start of his name. The rune itself is shaped like a small upward pointing arrow, up arrow, a figure with arms raised, a figure standing, looking up, with arms open. In the old Scandinavian world, warriors would sometimes scratch this rune onto the hilt of a sword before battle, as a quiet asking of the god's protection. The rune is one of the most often found in the surviving inscriptions of the runic age. The god, even in the late telling of the Norse stories, had not been forgotten. But by the time of the surviving texts, by the time, that is, of Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, sitting at his desk in Iceland, writing down what was left of the old religion, the god of Tyr had become a thinner figure than he once had been. There are passages in the Prose Edda where Snorri pauses before describing him, as if reaching, in his own 13th century way, for a memory that was already fading from the world. Tyr. What the surviving texts do tell us is that he was, in the older Germanic religious system, one of the highest gods. There is good reason to believe, and many scholars have argued this, that Tyr was, in the deep past, before Odin became the chief of the gods himself. The name Tyr is etymologically related to the Greek Zeus and the Latin Jupiter, which we say as Jupiter. All of them descended from a single Proto-Indo-European root meaning sky, or shining, or sky god. Tyr was, once, the sky father of the Germanic peoples. By the time the Norse texts were written down, that role had passed to Odin. But the older, simpler god of justice and of law and of the right outcome, that god was still Tyr. He is described, in what survives of him, as the bravest of the gods. Snorri uses this exact word. He says, in Gylfaginning, that Tyr was the bravest. He says that Tyr was the wisest. He says that anyone who wishes to surpass the rest of men in courage and good sense should call upon Tyr. Tyr was the god, that is, that you went to when you needed a hard thing done, a right thing, a thing that other gods, more cunning or more clever or more politic, would not do. The texts do not give us a long biography of him. They give us, in passing, that he had only one hand, that his right hand had been lost. We will come to how he lost it. And the texts give us, almost as an aside, what he did for the wolf. When Fenrir was first brought into Asgard, when he was small, the gods all took turns with him. They all, in the text's careful phrasing, fed him. They all, in the early days, were willing to walk to the wolf and lay food before him and stand beside him while he ate. But the wolf grew, and as he grew, the other gods, one by one, stopped going to him. By the time the wolf was at the size that bent the timbers of the hall, only Tyr was still willing. Only Tyr would walk, each day, to where the wolf was lying. Only Tyr would carry the meat. Only Tyr would set it down, and only Tyr would stand there, his hands empty and his eye open, while the wolf ate. We should pause on this. The other gods of Asgard had by then the high cunning, the far-seeing, the names that had been earned across worlds. Thor had his hammer, Odin had his ravens, Heimdallr could hear the grass grow, Freyr had his shining sword, Freya could fly in her cloak of falcon feathers across any sky. The Aesir were, in every account, beings of enormous power, and none of them, the texts tell us, would walk up to Fenrir. Only Tyr. There is, in this, something the texts do not need to say in so many words. Tyr was the bravest, not because he was the strongest. Thor was stronger, not because he was the wisest. Odin had drunk from Mimir's well, and Tyr had not because he was the highest. By the time the texts were written, Tyr had been, for centuries, no longer the chief god. Tyr was the bravest, because Tyr did the thing that needed doing. The wolf needed to be fed, so Tyr fed him. The other gods, who had taken the wolf in, who had brought him into their hall, who had decided that they would try to raise him, the other gods had by then stepped back. They were watching from a distance. They were leaving the daily task to one of their own. Tyr did not refuse. The texts give us very little of what passed between Tyr and the wolf in those long, quiet feedings. They do not give us conversation. They do not give us a slow growth of understanding. They give us only the steady fact. Tyr fed him, daily, without fail, while the gods watched from the high benches. There is a question worth asking here. Did the wolf, in those years, know what Tyr was doing? The Norse sources do not believe in unintelligent monsters. Fenrir, in the surviving texts, is not portrayed as a brute or as a beast. He is portrayed, when he speaks, as articulate. He is portrayed as suspicious, as careful, as alert to the meanings of what is done to him. He is, in his own way, a person in a wolf's shape and at a wolf's terrible scale, but a person. So when Tyr came to him with meat day after day, when Tyr stood quietly beside him while he ate, when Tyr did not pull back, did not show fear, did not look away, what did the wolf understand of that? The texts do not tell us. In my reading, and the texts do not tell us this, the wolf came in those long quiet feedings to understand Tyr in a way he did not understand any of the other gods. Not as a friend exactly. The wolf was not, by any reading of the text, a being who had friends, but as the one god whose presence did not carry the small flicker of fear that the wolf was, by then, accustomed to seeing in every other face. Tyr came to him steadily. Tyr fed him steadily. Tyr stood beside him steadily. And the wolf, in his huge intelligent watching, came to know that this god was not afraid of him. The moment that comes later, the moment when the wolf, having seen through the god's deception, asks for one of them to put a hand in his mouth as surety, has, when you sit with it, a particular shape. The wolf does not ask for any hand. He asks, by his refusal to be tested otherwise, for the hand of the god who has been willing to come close to him. The text does not give us the wolf's reasoning, but the wolf's reasoning, in my reading, is there beneath the surface of what the text gives us. But the texts do tell us this: when the moment came, much later, when the gods needed someone to put a hand into the wolf's mouth as surety, when they needed a god to step forward and offer that hand, the wolf knew which god to ask for. He did not ask for Odin. He did not ask for Thor. He asked for Tyr, the bravest, the just, the one who had fed him. We will get to that moment. What you should hold from this chapter is the shape of Tyr in the Hall of the Gods. He is not loud. He is not in the front of the stories. He is the god who, when the other gods stepped back, walked forward. He is the god who, when the cost would be paid, was the one to pay it. He is the figure who, in tonight's story, will lose more than any other. In the next chapter, we go to the first of the gods' attempts to bind the wolf. Chapter 4, the first two chains. The gods, the texts tell us, came at last to their council. The wolf could no longer be hosted in the high hall. The wolf had become too large, too suspicious, too aware. The Aesir gathered, the texts say, and they spoke of what was to be done. And what they decided was this: the wolf, the god said, must be bound, not killed. The texts are clear on this: not killed. Even in the height of their alarm, the gods did not move to kill Fenrir. There has been long argument among scholars about why. One reading is that because the gods had taken him in as a foster child, killing him would have been the breaking of the most ancient and most binding of social obligations, the obligation of the foster parent to the foster child. Another reading is that because Fenrir was Loki's son and Loki was Odin's blood brother, killing the wolf would have been the killing of a kinsman. A third reading is that the gods, foreseeing Ragnarok, knew the wolf could not be killed by ordinary means. He was to be the killer of Odin himself at the end of the world. Such a being could not be put down with a sword. Whatever the reading, the texts agree. The decision was not to kill, but to bind. And to bind, the gods' first thought would be simple. They were gods. The wolf, after all, was only a wolf. Even a wolf of unusual size and strangeness was, in the imagination of the Aesir, at this council, a creature that could be wrapped in iron and held. So they made a chain. The first chain was called Ledingr. The etymology of the name is not entirely certain. The old Norse scholars have argued about it for a long time. One reading connects it to a root, meaning to lay down. Another connects it to the kind of binding word used in legal proceedings. Whichever reading is right, the name carries the sense that this was a chain meant to settle the wolf, to hold him in place. The Aesir made this chain themselves in their own forges. They did not yet go to the dwarves. They thought, at this stage, that the work of binding could be done with their own hands. They forged the iron. They linked the links. They tested the strength of the chain against the strength of their own arms, and they were satisfied. Then they brought the chain to the wolf. The texts give us, here, one of the most quietly cunning passages in all of Norse literature. The gods did not come to Fenrir and say, "This is a chain." We have made it to bind you. Lie still while we place it around you. They did not say that. They said, instead, and the surviving accounts preserved this almost as a joke. They said, Fenrir, we have made this chain. We do not know how strong it is. Would you let us try it on you? It will be a test of your strength against the chains. We will see which is the greater. It is one of the small dark comedies of the surviving Edda. The gods, in their first attempt to bind the wolf, came to him in the language of sport, as if it were a game, as if there were no consequence, as if they were saying, "Come, friend, let us see how strong you are today." The wolf agreed. He agreed, the texts say, because he was confident in his own strength. He had grown to the size he had grown to. He had felt the bones of horses give way under his jaw. He had felt the timbers of the hall flex beneath his weight. The wolf looked at the chain. He looked at the gods, and he said, in effect, "Very well. Place it on me. We will see." The gods placed the chain, Lodinger, around him. They drew the chain tight. They stepped back. Fenrir kicked once. The chain, Lodinger, fell to the ground in pieces. The gods looked at it. The wolf looked at it. And the wolf, the texts tell us, was not displeased. He had won the game. He had proven his strength. He was, perhaps, even a little pleased to be in a game with the gods, who had until now never tested him in this way. The gods were silent. They went away to their council, and they spoke again of what to do. It was decided that they would make a second chain, a stronger one, twice as strong, the texts tell us, as the first, or, in some readings, of a stronger metal, of an iron worked with secret runes by the gods' best smiths. The chain was called Dromi. The name, in Old Norse, comes from a root meaning fetter or bond. It was a fetter in the most literal sense, a binding thing. The gods brought Dromi to the wolf. They came again in the language of sport. They came again as if it were a game. They said, and this is where the surviving texts begin to give us, very gently, the suggestion that the wolf was no longer entirely fooled. They said, Fenrir, your fame for breaking Lodinger has spread among us. We have made a stronger chain. Will you not test your strength again? Will you not be praised by all of the Aesir for the breaking of this one too? The wolf looked at Dromi. It was visibly heavier than Lodinger. It was visibly thicker. The eye of the wolf, the texts tell us, was beginning to grow wary. But the wolf said, "Very well, place it on me. I am willing." The gods placed Dromi around him. They drew it tight. The chain was so heavy that even the gods, the texts say, strained to lift it. They stepped back. The wolf gathered himself. He had to work this time. He kicked once. The chain held. He kicked again. The chain bent but did not break. He bucked. The chain creaked. The wolf, the texts tell us, had to put forth, for the first time, his real strength. And then the chain broke. The links of Dromi flew apart across the field. The pieces, the surviving sources say, lay scattered. The wolf rose, panting. He looked at the gods, and the wolf was even more pleased now than before. He had proven his strength a second time. He had broken even the strongest chain the gods themselves could make. The gods, the texts tell us, were beginning to be afraid. They went away again to their council, and they spoke of what was to be done. And there was, by now, the slow, heavy understanding in the council that they could not bind the wolf with the strength of their own forges. The gods of Asgard could not, by themselves, make a chain that would hold him. They would have to send for help, they would have to send for the dwarves. In the next chapter, we go down again, as we did last week, for the hammer, into the underground halls of Svartalfheim. Chapter 5. Down to Svartalfheim again. We were last in Svartalfheim only the week before, in the long telling of how Mjolnir was made. We walked there with Loki. Then, on the long road down, we watched him stand at the bellows. We watched the dwarves, Sindri and Broker, work at the anvil. We watched the gold form into the boar, Gullinbursti, the ring, Draupnir, the hammer that would, from that night forward, hang at Thor's belt. Tonight we go back. The gods, having failed twice to bind the wolf with chains of their own making, send a messenger down to the same dark country. This time, it is not Loki who goes. The texts give us the name of the messenger. He was called Skirnir, the bright one, the shining one. He was the servant, or, in some readings, the friend and follower, of the god Freyr. Freyr, who we will meet at length in a later episode of this season, was one of the Vanir, the second tribe of gods, who had come into Asgard after the long Aesir-Vanir war. Freyr was the god of fertility, of the sun and summer, of growing things. Skirnir was his messenger, his runner, the one he sent on tasks the surviving texts portray as urgent, delicate, and almost diplomatic. It is interesting that the gods chose Skirnir for this errand, and not, for example, Loki. Loki had been to Svartalfheim before. Loki, in the previous episode, has stood at the bellows and watched the dwarves work. Loki knew the road. Loki, in the trickster's way, would have been the obvious messenger. But the gods, by this point in the story, no longer entirely trusted Loki. They knew that Fenrir was Loki's son. They knew that Loki, while sworn to the Aesir, had his own loyalties and his own ambivalences. They did not want, on this errand, the trickster's hand on the message. They wanted someone simpler, someone bright, someone whose loyalty to the high gods was uncomplicated. So they sent Skirnir. Skirnir went down. The texts do not describe his journey in detail. They give us only that he went. He passed through whatever roads the messengers of the gods knew, perhaps along Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, perhaps along older paths that the surviving texts do not name. He came to Svartalfheim. He came to the door of the smiths. This time, the smiths are not Sindri and Broker. The surviving texts do not name them. Snorri tells us in the Prose Edda only that Skirnir came down to certain dwarves. He does not give them faces. He does not give them lineages. They are, in the only account that has come down to us, simply dwarves of the deep country, the unnamed smiths of Svartalfheim, who already, the texts hint, knew why Skirnir had come before he had spoken. You will remember, perhaps, that in the previous episode, the dwarves we met were named, the sons of Ivaldi, who made Sif's new gold hair and the spear Gungnir, and the ship Skidbladnir, the brothers Sindri and Brokkr, who made the boar Gullinbursti, the ring Draupnir, and Mjolnir itself. Those dwarves the surviving sources named because the story of the wager required them to be named. The wager was between two specific sets of smiths, and the gods needed to know who had made which treasure. Tonight's story is different. Tonight's story has no wager. Tonight's story has only a binding. The makers of the binding, the texts have not preserved by name. We can, in our own imagination, hold them as unnamed, as deeper, perhaps, even than the named dwarves, as the dwarves of dwarves. The smiths, the other smiths, went to when the work was beyond what they themselves could do. Skirnir came to them in their hall. He brought a message from the gods. The message, in the surviving telling, was this. The gods, said Skirnir, need a binding. They need a thing that will hold a wolf. The wolf is large, very large, larger than the gods' own forges can make a chain to hold. The gods have failed twice. They need a third binding. They need it to be different. They need it to be of such a kind that the wolf, when he sees it, will not believe it can hold him. And they need it to hold him anyway. The dwarves listened. The texts do not give us their faces. They give us only that they listened, and that after they had listened, they were quiet for a while, and that after they had been quiet, they said, and this is the part the surviving sources preserve almost as a riddle, they said, we will make it. We will make it of 6 things. The things we will use up. There will not be any of them left in the world after we are done. Skirnir, the texts tell us, did not understand. He asked, what 6 things? And the dwarves said, you will see. And they began. The dwarves of Svartalfheim, in the long old Norse imagination, were the keepers of the deepest crafts. They were the ones who knew the runes that the gods themselves did not yet know. They were the ones who could draw, from the materials of the deep world, the qualities that lived in those materials, the hardness of stone, the brightness of gold, the silence of shadow. For Gleipnir, the texts give us the name of the binding here, Gleipnir, which means, in rough Old Norse, the open one, or the deceiver, the one that catches. The dwarves use 6 things. 6 things that, in the world before the binding of Fenrir, the texts tell us, were present and known, and that, after the binding of Fenrir, were no longer present in the world. The dwarves used them up. The world has been thinner ever since. We come, in the next chapter, to what those 6 things were. Sleep, if you are ready to. The list is one of the most beloved passages in all of Norse mythology, and the listing of it is, in its own quiet way, a lullaby. Chapter 6. The 6 Impossible Things. The first of the things the dwarves used in the making of Gleipnir was the sound of a cat's footfall. This is what the texts say. The Prose Edda preserves the line. The first of the 6 was the sound that a cat makes when it walks. The slight, almost not there pressure of a cat's foot on a wooden floor. The almost silence of it. The way a cat can cross a room while a person who is sitting in it does not look up. The dwarves took this. They took the sound. They wove it into the chord. This, the surviving Edda tells us, is the reason that cats now walk silently. The sound, before, had been in the world. The dwarves used it. The sound that remained, the sound that a cat now makes when it crosses a floor, is what was left after the dwarves had taken what they needed. Cats walk silently because the dwarves needed the sound of their footfalls for the binding of the wolf. This is a beautiful piece of mythic reasoning. It is also, in the way the Old Norse sources sometimes do, a small piece of folk explanation. Why do cats walk silently? Because the dwarves used up the rest of the sound long ago. The second of the things the dwarves used was a woman's beard. This may sound strange to a modern ear, but the texts are specific. The second ingredient was the beard of a woman, and the explanation, and this is one of the small dry jokes of the surviving sources, is that before the binding of Fenrir, women had beards. After the binding of Fenrir, they did not. The dwarves used them up. The Old Norse word for beard, skegg, would have been familiar to every household. The beard of a man was, in the old Scandinavian world, one of the markers of his standing. The beard of Thor, of Odin, of every warrior in the Longhouse, was groomed and tended. The texts of the Edda do not tell us what a woman's beard, in the time before the binding, had looked like. The texts tell us only that there had been one, and that, after the binding, there was no longer. The third of the things the dwarves used was the roots of a mountain. This one, perhaps, lands more easily in the modern ear. The roots of a mountain. The deep parts of stone that go down into the earth, that anchor the mountain to whatever is below, that hold it in place against the slow turning of the world. The dwarves, the texts say, took those roots, used them. The mountains have, since the binding of Fenrir, been rootless. They are held in place now only by their own weight, by their own resting. The roots are gone. This is the kind of detail that, when you sit with it for a long, quiet moment, does something to your sense of the world. It says, the mountain is heavier than it looks. It says, the mountain is balanced now, where once it was anchored. It says, the world has been, since the story, a little less steady than it once was. The fourth of the things the dwarves used was the sinews of a bear. Sinew, the tough silvery cord that runs along the muscle of an animal and connects it to the bone. In the old Scandinavian world, the sinews of large animals were used for the strings of bows, for binding the iron head onto a spear shaft, for the silent strength inside every craft. The sinew of a bear was particularly valued. A bear was the largest land animal of the Norse imagination. Its sinew was the strongest of the bindings the human craft could make. The dwarves took the sinews of a bear, used them, wove them into Gleipnir. The fifth of the things the dwarves used was the breath of a fish. You may, listening now, find your eye opening a little at this. The breath of a fish. What does a fish breathe? A fish, in the old Norse imagination, did not breathe the air that humans breathe. A fish moved through the water, opening its mouth, and from its gills came a slight pulse, a small, almost silent rhythm that the old Norse people, who knew their cold rivers and their cold seas, would have noticed as they pulled fish from the water and watched them lie in the bottom of the boat. The breath of a fish was that pulse, that small, last, quiet exhalation. The dwarves took it, used it, and the sixth, the last, of the things the dwarves used was the spittle of a bird. The Old Norse texts pause on this one too, in the way they do. The spittle of a bird, the almost nothing, the just barely there, the moisture inside a bird's beak that you would not see unless you looked very closely. The dwarves used it. These were the six things: the sound of a cat's footfall, a woman's beard, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. You may notice, if you let the list settle, that each of the six is a thing that the old Norse imagination would have called almost not there. They are not, like iron or like gold or like stone, the things you can pick up and hold. They are not, like the strength of a god or the speed of a wind, the things you can name and measure. They are the things at the very edge of presence, the sound a cat makes that is just barely a sound, the beard of a woman that, even when it was in the world, was not the central marker of her, the roots of a mountain that no one had ever seen, only inferred, the sinew of a bear, which is the strength inside the strength, the breath of a fish, which is the breath inside an animal that does not seem to breathe at all, the spittle of a bird, which is the smallest moisture inside the lightest of all flying things. The surviving texts do not tell us why the dwarves chose these six things. The prose Edda lists the ingredients without explaining the reasoning behind them. What I would offer here, as one way of understanding the choice, is this. The gods had tried to bind the wolf with the things he could feel, the iron of Ladingr, the iron of Dromi, the chains of the high forges. The wolf had felt them and had broken them. So the dwarves, when the gods came to them in their need, may have reasoned in the deep way of the dwarves that the wolf could not be bound by anything he could feel. He could only be bound by what he could not feel, by the absences, by the things at the edge of presence, by what was barely there. This is, perhaps, the kind of reasoning that old Norse imagination loved, the kind of reasoning that says, the thing you cannot see is stronger than the thing you can. The thing that is barely there is the thing that holds. The lightest binding is, in the end, the only binding that lasts. The Eddic poets did not write this down for us in so many words, but the listener, even the listener at the edge of sleep, can sit with the possibility. And the possibility is, in its way, the most Norse of all the things in the story. The dwarves took the 6 things and they wove them into a single cord, and the cord, when it was done, was, the texts tell us, smooth as a silken ribbon, light as a thread of spider silk, soft enough to be coiled into the palm of a single hand. It was so light that it seemed almost not to be there. It was so smooth that it seemed it could not possibly hold anything. This was Gleipnir, the deceiver, the open one, the one that catches. The dwarves gave it to Skirnir. Skirnir, the messenger, took the small soft ribbon in his hand. He looked at it. He must, the texts hint, have wondered how this small thing was meant to hold the wolf. He must have wondered whether the dwarves had played some joke on him. But the dwarves, in the surviving sources, gave him no further explanation. They said only, "Take it. Bring it to the gods. They will know what to do." And Skirnir, holding the small ribbon of impossible things in his closed fist, climbed back up the road from Svartalfheim. And he came home to Asgard, and he gave the ribbon to the gods. In the next chapter, we walk to the island where the binding will be made. Chapter 7. The Ribbon in the Hand. When Skirnir came back to Asgard, the gods were waiting in their council hall. He set the small bright thing on the table before them. The texts give us the scene. The gods looked at it. They did not at first believe it. "This," they said, "this is what the dwarves made." Skirnir said, "Yes." "This," they said again, "this silken ribbon, this little soft cord that we could break between our fingers." Skirnir said, "Yes." They said it would hold him. There was, the surviving sources tell us, a long silence in the council. The gods looked at the ribbon. They looked at one another. Some of them, in the slow way of the long-lived, took the ribbon in their hands and tested it. They pulled gently at it. They pulled harder. They strained against it with the strength of gods. The ribbon did not break. The gods, the texts say, were astonished. They tried again. The strongest of them, Thor was not yet at Mjolnir's side in this telling, but Thor was nonetheless there with his bare hands and the great strength of his bare hands. Thor took the ribbon and pulled. The ribbon did not move. The ribbon did not stretch. The ribbon held. The gods began, slowly, to understand what the dwarves had given them. It was not a thing of weight. It was not a thing of mass. It was not a chain in the sense the gods had been thinking about chains. It was a binding made of qualities that had been taken out of the world and woven together. And the qualities the silence of cats, the softness of women, the steadiness of mountains, the strength of bears, the patience of fish, the quiet of birds, were not the kind of thing that strength could break. The strongest god in Asgard, pulling on Gleipnir, was pulling against the deep order of the world. The gods, the texts tell us, were satisfied at last, but they were also, the texts tell us, beginning to be afraid of how they would get the wolf to allow it to be placed on him. Because Fenrir was not, by this point in the story, a foolish child. He had been brought to Asgard as a small thing. He had grown in the high hall. He had watched the gods, one by one, step back from him. He had felt their eyes change. He had broken Ledingr. He had broken Dromi. He had heard, in his huge intelligent ears, the conversations of the gods at council. He had seen, the texts hint, the messenger Skirnir come back from the deep places carrying something small in his closed fist. He had noticed. The wolf, by this point, was watchful in a way the gods could not have anticipated when they took him in. The wolf was, perhaps, even sad. The texts do not say. But the wolf was certainly suspicious. He knew that the gods were planning something. He knew that whatever they were planning involved him. And he knew that the small, soft ribbon they had asked him to be tested with would not be the simple game the chains had been. The Aesir came to him. They came in their numbers this time. Not just one or two of them. Not just the messenger. They came in a small procession, Odin at their head, in his blue cloak with his hood drawn forward, Thor beside him, the great red beard catching the light, Skirnir holding the small ribbon, and, near the back of the procession, walking quietly, Tyr. They came to the wolf. They did not, this time, immediately go into the language of sport. They did not say, immediately, "Come try this against your strength." They paused. The texts give us the pause. They looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at them. And there was, in the long moment before anyone spoke, the understanding on all sides that the game had moved into a different country. Then Odin spoke. He spoke, the surviving texts tell us, in the easy voice the Allfather used when he wanted to make a thing seem smaller than it was. He said, "Fenrir, we have come to you again with a binding. This one is small, as you can see. It is no more than a silken band. It has been made by the smiths of the deep country, and they have given it certain qualities. Will you not test it against your strength, as you tested the others? Will you not break this little thing for our entertainment, and we will be done?" The wolf looked at Gleipnir. The wolf, the texts say, was silent for a long while. The wolf, when he spoke quietly. He said, "I see that this is small. I see that it is light. I see that it looks like a ribbon a child would tie in its hair." The gods waited. The wolf went on. He said, "I see also that it has been brought from the deep country. I see also that the gods of Asgard, who have failed twice now to bind me, would not bring me a third binding unless they thought it would hold. I see also that you would not, all of you, have come to watch this small entertainment unless you thought there was something to watch." The gods, the texts tell us, did not answer. The wolf, in the silence that followed, raised his enormous head a little. He spoke again. He said, "There is no honor in my breaking of a thing that has clearly been made to hold me. There is no honor in pretending we do not all know what this is. I will not be made foolish by this game." The gods, the texts tell us, did not yet despair. They had expected this. They had thought, in their council, about what to do if the wolf saw through them, and they had a thing prepared. In the next chapter, we go to the test the wolf himself proposed. Chapter 8. The test the wolf proposed. The wolf, having seen through the god's game, made a counter-proposal. He said, "I will allow you to place this ribbon on me. I will allow you to make the test, but only if one of you will put your hand into my mouth and keep it there while the test is made, so that if I am being deceived, so that if you have made a thing meant to hold me, and you have brought it here to put it on me by trickery, I will know that the cost of the trick will be the hand of one of the gods." The texts pause here. They give us the long quiet of the gods looking at one another. This is one of the most carefully constructed moments in all of Norse mythology. The wolf has not refused the binding. The wolf has not run. The wolf has not turned. He has, instead, set a condition that, on its face, sounds reasonable. He is willing to be tested, but only with a pledge in the form of a hand. The gods, the texts say, were silent, because the gods knew, exactly and without any doubt, what the wolf was asking for. The wolf was asking for a sworn oath, a pledge that, in the old Norse legal imagination, would bind the entire community of the Aesir to the truth of what they were claiming. And the gods knew that they were lying. They knew that Gleipnir was meant to hold him. They knew that, when Fenrir failed to break it, they would not release him. They would leave him bound. The trick was the whole point. So the wolf, by asking for the hand, was asking for the gods to make a pledge they could not honor. And the cost of the failed pledge, the cost the wolf was naming, would be the hand of the god who put it in. The Aesir looked at one another. Odin, the texts tell us, said nothing. Odin, the wise one, the one who had given his eye at the well of Mimir, the one who had hung 9 nights on the world tree, was not, even in his bravery, willing to give a hand. He had given enough. Thor, the texts tell us, said nothing. Thor, in some readings of the surviving sources, was not yet at the council when this was discussed. In others, Thor was there, but did not speak. Thor was strong. Thor was loud. But Thor did not, at this council, put his hand into the wolf's mouth. Heimdallr, the watcher of the bridge, said nothing. Freyr, the bright god of fertility, said nothing. Bragi, the god of poetry, said nothing. The texts walk us, one by one, through the gods of the council. None of them spoke. None of them stepped forward. And then, the texts tell us, Tyr stepped forward. Tyr, the bravest, the just, the one who had fed the wolf in the high hall when no other god would walk to him, the one who had stood beside him daily and watched him grow and known what he was growing into and not turned away. Tyr stepped forward. Tyr said, "I will do it." The wolf, the texts tell us, looked at Tyr. There is, in this moment, something the surviving sources do not need to spell out. The wolf had known Tyr. The wolf had eaten from his hand. The wolf, in the long quiet years of the high hall, had been fed by this god, had been the recipient of his daily steady kindness. And now, in the moment when the wolf was asking for a pledge, the only god who would step forward was the one god who had not turned away from him. This is the cruelty at the heart of tonight's story. The bravest god, the god who had been most faithful to the wolf, who had been most willing, who had not withdrawn his hand, was the one who would have to lie to him. Tyr knew it. The wolf, the text's hint, may have known it too. We will return to that question in a moment. Tyr walked forward. He came up to the wolf. He stopped at the wolf's great head, which was at the level of his own chest, he raised his right hand. The right hand. The texts are specific. The sword hand. The hand that, in the Old Norse imagination, was the hand of a warrior's identity. The hand that held the blade in battle. The hand that, on a warrior, was the hand he could least afford to lose. Tyr raised his right hand. He put it forward. The wolf opened his mouth. Tyr placed his hand inside. The texts pause here, in the way they do at the deepest moments. They give us only. He placed his hand inside. The wolf closed his jaws. Not hard, not yet. He closed his jaws gently around Tyr's wrist, and he held the hand there. Tyr did not pull back. Tyr did not flinch. In the next chapter, the gods make the binding. Chapter 9. The binding. The Aesir, with Tyr's hand in the wolf's mouth, came forward with Gleipnir. They came quietly. They did not laugh, the texts tell us. They did not joke. They did not now pretend, as they had in the binding of Ledingr and the binding of Dromi, that this was a game. The mood had passed beyond the language of sport. The mood was now, in the surviving sources, the mood of an execution, a binding, a solemn thing. Skirnir, the messenger, held one end of the ribbon. Another of the gods held the other end. Slowly, slowly, they wound Gleipnir around the wolf. The wolf did not resist them while they wound it. He stood, with Tyr's hand still in his mouth, and he let the gods do the binding. He had to. He had made the pledge that he would. He had bound himself to the test by his own word. The gods wound Gleipnir around his legs, around his chest, around his neck. The ribbon, being light as a silken thread, took only a few wraps. It did not feel heavy on him. It did not feel, the wolf would have said, if he could speak in the moment, like a chain. It felt like a thing a child had tied around him in a game. The gods stepped back. They had taken him to an island for the binding. The texts give us the name of the island. It was called Lyngvi. In Old Norse, the name comes from a root meaning heather or heathland. It was a small island in a lake. The lake itself was called Svartalfheim, the Black Lake, the dark water. The island was in the dark water, in the middle of the world, in a place the wolf could not easily walk back from even if he could break free. They had chosen the place with care. They stepped back. They let the wolf stand free on the island with the ribbon around him. They watched. The wolf gathered himself. He kicked once, as he had done with Ledingr. The ribbon did not break. He kicked harder, as he had done with Dromi. The ribbon did not give. He pulled. He twisted. He threw his enormous weight against the ribbon. He brought to bear the strength that had broken the first two chains, and that, until this moment, he had not believed any binding could resist. The ribbon did not break. The wolf, the texts tell us, understood. He understood, in that moment, that he had been deceived, that the small soft ribbon was not a small soft ribbon, that it was a binding made by the dwarves of the deep country out of the qualities of the world, that the gods had brought it to him in trickery, that the test had not been a test, that the pledge had not been a pledge, and so, the wolf, doing what he had said he would do, closed his jaws. He closed them on Tyr's hand. He bit through. Tyr's right hand, his sword hand, came off at the wrist. The texts give us this moment, again, in very few words. They do not linger. They do not draw it out. They give us only what happened. The wolf bit through. Tyr lost the hand. The Aesir, the surviving sources tell us, did not laugh. They had bound the wolf. They had succeeded in the thing they had come to do, but they had paid for it, and they had paid for it through the body of one of their own, the bravest, the just, the one who had fed the wolf. Tyr stepped back from the wolf, his right arm ending now at the wrist. He did not, the texts say, cry out. He did not, in the surviving sources, complain. He turned and he walked back to the gathered company of the gods, and the gods received him in silence. And then the gods did the last of what they had come to do. They took a great sword. They drove its hilt deep into the ground at the wolf's feet. They placed the point of the sword in the wolf's lower jaw, and they propped his upper jaw open against the point of it, so that the wolf, from that moment on, could not close his mouth. The wolf's mouth would not close, and from his mouth, from the open mouth of the bound wolf on the island Lyngvi, in the dark lake Svartalfheim, there began, the texts tell us, to flow a river of saliva, a long, quiet, steady flow. The river had a name. The river was called Von. In Old Norse, Von means hope. The river of hope flows still, the texts say. It flows from the mouth of the bound wolf, and there it will continue to flow until Ragnarok, until the wolf, in some far-off cold morning, finally pulls himself free. We will come to that morning in a later episode of this season. We will not come to it tonight. Tonight is the binding. The binding holds. In the next chapter, we sit a while with Tyr, with what he lost, with what he became. Chapter 10. The god who could not hold a sword. Tyr returned to Asgard with one hand. The texts do not tell us how he was received by the other gods. They do not give us a scene of welcome or of grief. They give us only that he came back, and that he was, from that day forward, known as Tyr the One-Handed. This is one of the quieter changes that the surviving Norse sources record. The change in what a god was called. Before the binding of Fenrir, Tyr was Tyr, the just, the brave, the sky god of the older Germanic religion, the one whose rune was scratched on the hilts of swords for good fortune in battle. After the binding of Fenrir, he was Tyr, the One-Handed. The text had a new epithet for him. The text noted, almost in passing, that he could no longer hold a sword in the way a warrior held a sword. He could not, the surviving sources hint, hold a shield. He could no longer, in the simple physical sense, be the warrior god he had been. And yet, the texts continue to tell stories about him. He continues to appear in the council of the gods. He continues to be present. He continues to be, in some readings, the figure the gods turn to when a hard thing must be done. Tyr, the One-Handed, was, in the surviving Norse imagination, no less a god than Tyr the Two-Handed had been. He was, perhaps, more. There is a reason for this. There is a reason that when the late Norse poets thought about Tyr, they thought about him, not in terms of what he had lost, but in terms of what he had given. What he had given was his sword hand. The surviving sources do not, in so many words, tell us what was in Tyr's mind when he stepped forward. They tell us only that he did. They tell us that he placed his right hand in the wolf's mouth, and that the wolf, when the binding held, closed his jaws on it. The texts are spare. They do not give us his thoughts. But what we can see, from the larger shape of the story, is this. Tyr had stepped forward at the council when no other god would. He had walked to the wolf. He had placed his hand in the wolf's mouth, and the rest of the gods had, in their council, already decided what was going to happen with Gleipnir. They had already decided that the binding was meant to hold. They had already decided that the test was not a test. They had already decided that the wolf would not be released. It is one thing to lose a hand by misfortune. It is another to lose it by knowing what you're walking into. The text does not put this in those words, but the situation and the silence of the surviving sources, which is itself a kind of speaking, invites us to ask whether Tyr knew. Whether, when he stepped forward, he understood that the binding was meant to hold, and that the wolf, being honorable, would take what had been pledged. I believe, in my own reading, that he did. The figure who emerges from the larger Norse sources is not a god who would have been unaware. Tyr was the bravest. Tyr was the wisest in matters of right outcomes. Tyr had been the one feeding the wolf, and so Tyr had seen, perhaps more clearly than any of the other gods, what the wolf was and what the binding would do. He was not, perhaps, the unlucky one. He was the one who had volunteered for the cost. The text may not say it, but the text may not need to. This is, in the long old Germanic religious imagination, what justice looked like. Not the absence of cost, not the avoidance of harm, not the careful navigation of the rules so that no one had to pay. Justice was the willingness, when the cost had to be borne, to bear it yourself. And Tyr, the brave Tyr, the just Tyr, the god who had fed the wolf in the high hall, had been the one to bear it. The wolf had bound himself by his word. The gods had bound themselves by their word too. They had pledged, and the pledge was paid, not in some abstract way, not in some symbolic way, but in the actual hand of the actual God who had given it. The wolf, in his terrible moment, had been more honorable than the gods themselves had wanted to be. The wolf had honored the pledge by taking the hand, and Tyr had honored the pledge by giving it. This is a strange thing to sit with in the modern ear. It is strange because the modern ear is used to mythologies, in which the heroes are simply right and the monsters are simply wrong. The Norse myths do not work this way. The Norse myths give us a wolf who has been treated unjustly, and who, in his treatment, conducts himself with a kind of awful dignity. The Norse myths give us gods who, in their fear of the future, do a thing the rules of their own justice condemn, and who pay, through the body of their bravest, the cost that justice demands. The Norse myths give us, in this single story, a kind of moral honesty that the modern ear is not always ready for. Tyr was the god who paid. The texts call him, in some of the older Eddic passages, the one-handed god of victory. This is, in its way, a strange title for a god who had just lost the part of his body most useful for fighting. But the title is honest. Tyr was a god of victory because Tyr had won the thing that needed to be won. The wolf was bound. The world was, for now, safe. Tyr had paid for it. There is more to the figure of Tyr than this one story. There are other tales of him in the surviving sources. Some of them are funny. Tyr's father, in some genealogies, was a giant of 900 heads. Some of them are quieter. Tyr was, in some readings, the god you called on when you needed a thing to be settled rightly between two parties. Tyr was the god of the thing meeting, the local council, the place where, in the old Scandinavian world, free men gathered to decide questions of law. Tyr, in this larger sense, was the god of right outcomes, of binding agreements, of the moment when a word, once given, had to be honored. There is a small thing the surviving texts tell us about Tyr that is worth pausing on. He was, the older Eddic sources hint, the god of the thing meeting. The thing, An Old Norse thing was the local council of free men gathered at a set place at a set time of year, who decided the questions of law that had to be decided, whether a debt was owed, whether a wrong had been done, whether a marriage was lawful, whether a man who had killed another man owed vergeld, the man price for the killing, or whether he was to be made an outlaw. These were the questions of the thing. The thing was, in the old Scandinavian world, one of the most ancient institutions. It predated by a great deal the coming of kings. It predated by even more the coming of Christianity. The thing was the place where the law was made by the free men of the community in the open air, under the eye of whatever God watched over the giving and the receiving of words. That God was Tyr. We can see this even in the modern map of Northern Europe, the town in Denmark called Tinghøj, the Norwegian Tingvoll, the Icelandic Thingvellir, where the Althing met for nearly 1,000 years, the English place names that end in ting or thing. All of these are the descendants of the old Germanic thing, the place where the people gathered under the sky god to settle their questions. The day of the week named for Tyr is Tuesday. In Old English, Tuesdag, the day of Tw, who was the same god as Tyr by a different name. In the modern Germanic languages, we still say it. Tuesday in English, Tirsdag in Danish, Dienstag in German, the god of the thing, the god of right outcomes, the god who paid for the binding of Fenrir with his hand. That god is still in our calendar. Every week, quietly, unremarked, the way many old things still are. This is the figure that the surviving Norse sources give us when we look at him in full, not just the warrior who lost a hand to a wolf, but the older, quieter sky god of justice, who, by the time the Norse texts were written down, had been displaced from the center of the religion by his younger, more cunning relative Odin, but who had not been forgotten, whose rune was still on the swords, whose day was still in the week, whose name was still spoken at the thing. Tyr, in this larger sense, was the god of right outcomes, of binding agreements, of the moment when a word, once given, had to be honored. And it is fitting, in a way that the surviving Norse sources may have known and may have chosen, that Tyr was the god who lost his hand in the binding of Fenrir, because the binding of Fenrir was the moment in the deep Norse imagination when the gods themselves had had to step outside of right outcomes. They had had to lie. They had had to deceive. And the god of right outcomes had paid for it. That is the figure we should hold from this episode in the back of the mind as we drift. Tyr, the bravest, the one who paid. Chapter 11, What was lost, what was held. The wolf is bound on Lyngvi. Tyr has gone back to Asgard. The gods have, by the end of the story, gotten what they came for. The wolf will not roam free. The wolf will not, in the years between the story and Ragnarok, walk into the high hall and devour the gods one by one. The threat that the seers had spoken of has been deferred. The world has been given time, but the world has been given time at a cost. The cost has been Tyr's hand. The cost has been the trust of the wolf, which the gods had at first cultivated and which they have now broken. The cost has been the binding of Fenrir himself, which was not justice in the simple sense. The wolf had not done anything yet when he was bound. He had not yet attacked the gods. He had not yet killed Odin. He had not, in the timeline of the surviving stories, committed any crime. He had been bound for what he would do. He had been bound for the prophecy. He had been bound, the surviving sources hint on the strength of a vision the seers had had, a vision of a far cold morning at the end of time, a vision of a wolf swallowing the sun, a vision of the death of the All-Father. This is a difficult thing to sit with. The Norse myths do not soften it. They do not tell us, in the way some other mythologies might, that the wolf was wicked and deserved his binding. They tell us instead that the gods bound him because they were afraid. They were afraid of what he would become. They were not, in the moment of the binding, acting on what he was. The wolf had, at the time of his binding, been a guest in their hall. He had eaten their food. He had grown among them. He had been kind, in the way a wolf can be kind, to the one God who had fed him. He had not, until the moment of the binding, lifted a paw against any of them, and they bound him for what he would one day do. There has been long argument among readers of the surviving Norse sources about whether this is a story of justice or of injustice. The argument does not, in the texts themselves, resolve. The Eddic poets did not, it seems, want it to resolve. They wanted us, when we listened, to feel both sides, to feel the god's fear, and to feel the wolf's grievance, to feel that the binding was necessary, and to feel that the binding was wrong, to feel that Tyr was the bravest god, and to feel that Tyr had been forced into a betrayal of someone who had trusted him. This is what the Norse myths give us when they are at their best. They give us moral situations that do not resolve. They give us actions that have cost and that nonetheless had to be taken. They give us heroes who have paid prices that no fully just hero should have had to pay. The binding of Fenrir is, in this sense, a story about the moral cost of the future. The gods bound the wolf because the future required it. The future, in the Norse imagination, was not a thing the gods could avoid. They could only meet it earlier or later, sooner or later, on better terms or on worse. By binding the wolf, they were meeting the future earlier and on better terms. They were buying time. They were trading Tyr's hand and the wolf's freedom for the deferral of Ragnarok by an unknown number of years. This was, in their reckoning, worth the cost. We do not have to agree with their reckoning to understand it. We can, in the long, quiet evening of this episode, sit with the story as the Norse poets gave it to us. We can hold the gods and the wolf and Tyr all in the mind at once. We can feel the strangeness of it. We can feel the weight of it. There is one last thing the surviving texts tell us, and we should not leave it out. The wolf, on Lyngvi, in the dark lake am Svartalfheim, bound by the ribbon Gleipnir, with his jaws propped open and the river of saliva flowing from his mouth. The wolf is said to be growing. He is growing. The texts do not say this in many words, but the suggestion is there. The wolf, even bound, is not still. The wolf is doing, slowly, what wolves do. He is increasing. His body is, year by year, becoming larger. The ribbon Gleipnir is, year by year, accommodating his growth. The ribbon does not break. The ribbon holds. But the wolf inside the ribbon is, by some long, quiet measurement, larger than he was when the gods first bound him. This means that the binding is not, in the long Norse imagination, a binding outside of time. It is a binding inside of time. It is a binding that exists while the world exists. And the wolf, inside the binding, is preparing, slowly, patiently, year after year, for the day the binding will end. That day will be Ragnarok. We will not, tonight, walk into Ragnarok. Ragnarok has its own episode, much later in the season, when we will sit with the wolf again as he finally pulls himself free, and as the long quiet of his binding finally ends, tonight we sit with the binding itself, with the long patience of the wolf, with the long patience of the gods who put him there, with the steady flow of the river Vaughn, the river of hope, the river that the wolf's open mouth feeds. It is a strange detail, the name of that river, hope. The texts do not tell us whose hope. They do not tell us whether it is the god's hope that the binding will hold, or the wolf's hope that one day it will not, or some older, deeper hope, the hope of the world itself, that whatever comes at the end of time will, in some far-off form, be made right. The Norse poets, when they named the river, did not say, "We can sit with the ambiguity, we can let it be what it is." In the last chapter, we say goodnight. Chapter 12, Goodnight, and the wolf at the edge of time. It is late, or it is, by now, perhaps, the very early hours of a new morning. If you are still awake, I'd like to draw you back, gently, from the island, and from the lake, and from the bound wolf. We are leaving Fenrir on Lyngvi. We are leaving Tyr in Asgard with his one hand. We are leaving the gods at their council, where they have done a hard thing, and where they will, in the years to come, have to sit with the cost of it. There is no neat closing to this story. The Norse myths do not close neatly. They open into other stories. They open into the long arc of the season. The wolf on the island is waiting. The trickster, who is the wolf's father, is still in Asgard and is still, though the gods do not yet know how, preparing what will become his own long binding. The serpent in the sea is biting his tail. The daughter, Hel, is gathering the dead in her cold halls below. The world, in the long Norse reckoning, is moving toward the cold morning that the seers had seen. But not tonight. Tonight, the wolf is on the island, and the ribbon holds, and the river of hope flows from his mouth, and the gods sleep in Valhall, and Tyr, the brave Tyr, the just Tyr, the god who paid, sits at the high bench with one hand, resting on the table where, until recently, he had two. The world is for now held. This is one of the small gifts of the Norse imagination. It does not pretend that the holding is permanent. It does not pretend that the cost was not paid. It gives us instead the long quiet of an evening in which the thing that needed to be done has been done, and in which we, the listeners, can sit beside the gods at the long fire, and we can hear the wind outside, and we can know that, for tonight at least, the wolf is not at our door. If you have been listening since the first episode, you have come, by now, through a great deal of the shape of the Norse imagination. You have walked the 9 worlds. You have followed the Allfather through his long search for wisdom. You have gone down with Loki into the dwarven country and seen the hammer made. And tonight, you have sat with the gods at the council where the wolf was bound. You have seen, in this single season, the structure of the world, the wisdom of its highest god, the making of its greatest weapon, the first of the bindings that the world depends on. There is a great deal still to come. There is the theft of Idun's apples, which will be the next episode. There is the death of Balder, which will be the most beautiful and the saddest of all of these stories, the story that the Norse poets themselves believed was the turning of the world. There is the long punishment of Loki, who has been with us through every episode so far, and whose own binding will, in its own way, mirror the binding of his son. There is the mead of poetry, which will be a lighter and a stranger and a kinder story. There is the second tribe of gods, the Vanir, whom we will meet at last, there is the long human story of Sigurd and the dragon. And there is, at the end of the season, Ragnarok itself. And then, after Ragnarok, the quiet morning of the new world. But all of that is for the weeks ahead. For tonight, we leave the wolf bound on Lyngvi. We leave Tyr with his hand gone. We leave the gods in their hall, looking at one another across the long fire, knowing what they have done. If you have fallen asleep in the middle of this story, the river of hope is still flowing. The wolf is still bound. The ribbon is still holding. None of it requires your attention. It will continue without you. If you have stayed awake to the end, thank you. I do not know who you are, but I'm glad to have walked this far with you. There will be another episode in a few days, and another after that, and another after that. The Almanac is patient, and the Almanac will continue. Sleep well. Let me, before we close, take you through one more long, quiet round of the worlds, so that you have the shape of the season in your mind as you drift. In the high hall of Asgard, the All-Father is in his seat. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, have come home from their long day's flight across the 9 worlds, and they are perched now, one on each of his shoulders. They are quiet. They have already told him everything they have seen. They will fly out again tomorrow. They will come home again. This is the long rhythm of the All-Father's days. In the same hall, at his own place, Thor is sleeping. The hammer is on the bench beside him. The red beard rises and falls, slowly, with his breathing. The hall is warm with the fires. The other gods are in their places. Heimdallr, who watches the bridge of burning light, is at his post. The surviving texts tell us he is the watcher who needs the least sleep of any of the gods, but tonight even he is quiet. Freyr is in his own hall, Freya in hers. Bragi is, perhaps, still awake, finishing a verse he has been working on. The hall is, for now, at rest. In a smaller seat off to one side, Tyr is sleeping. His right arm ends at the wrist. The wrappings have, by now, healed. The arm has its own way of resting on the bench. He has learned, over the long quiet years since the binding, how to live with one hand. He does not, in the surviving texts, complain. He sleeps the way a brave man sleeps, who has done a hard thing and who is at peace with having done it. Outside the hall, the long night of Asgard stretches over the worlds. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, glimmers faintly in the dark. The roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, descend into the wells beneath. The serpent Jormungandr is coiled in the great sea, his tail in his mouth, asleep. Hel, in her cold halls below, walks among her quiet dead. And on the small island Lyngvi, in the dark lake Amsvartnir, the wolf is bound. He is awake, or he is asleep. The texts do not say. The wolf may, in the long centuries of his binding, have learned how to be both at once, to rest one part of himself while the other part watches. The river of saliva flows from his mouth. It has its name, Vaughn. Hope. The river flows toward whatever far place rivers flow. The mountains, which are no longer rooted to anything below, sit by their own weight in their old places. The cats walk silently in the empty halls. The women do not have beards. The fish breathe their small, silent breaths in the rivers and the seas. The birds, in their light bodies, hold their small moisture inside their beaks. The world is, for tonight, held in the way it is held, with the cost paid, with the bindings in their places, with the gods asleep, with the wolf bound, with the long, patient rivers running. If you have been listening since the first episode, you have come, by now, through a great deal of the shape of the Norse imagination. You have walked the 9 worlds. You have followed the Allfather through his long search for wisdom. You have gone down with Loki into the dwarven country and seen the hammer made. And tonight you have sat with the gods at the council where the wolf was bound. You have seen, in this single season, the structure of the world, the wisdom of its highest god, the making of its greatest weapon, the first of the bindings that the world depends on. There is a great deal still to come. There is the theft of Idun's apples, which will be the next episode. There is the death of Balder, which will be the most beautiful and the saddest of all of these stories, the story that the Norse poets themselves believed was the turning of the world. There is the long punishment of Loki, who has been with us through every episode so far, and whose own binding will, in its own way, mirror the binding of his son. There is the mead of poetry, which will be a lighter and a stranger and a kinder story. There is the second tribe of gods, the Fenrir, whom we will meet at last. There is the long human story of Sigurd and the dragon. And there is, at the end of the season, Ragnarok itself. And then, after Ragnarok, the quiet morning of the new world. But all of that is for the weeks ahead. For tonight, we leave the wolf bound on Lyngvi. We leave Tyr with his hand gone. We leave the gods in their hall, looking at one another across the long fire, knowing what they have done. If you have fallen asleep in the middle of this story, the river of hope is still flowing. The wolf is still bound. The ribbon is still holding. None of it requires your attention. It will continue without you. If you have stayed awake to the end, thank you. I do not know who you are, but I am glad to have walked this far with you. There will be another episode in a few days, and another after that, and another after that. The Almanac is patient, and the Almanac will continue. Sleep well. The Allfather is in his hall. The hammer is at Thor's belt. The wolf is bound on the island. The river of hope is flowing. And the long quiet of the night is, for once, held. Good night.